Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Hostrip, and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now, you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. In today's episode, I'm talking to Emmy Award-winning composer and solo artist Michael Price. So thank you again to the wonderful people at Audio Socket ASX for allowing me to use that piece of music as the opening gambit. It's called Dark Arts and was written by me. So I need to start this episode by saying I have been fact-checked. Finally, somebody has picked up on something that I've said that was wrong and has written in to tell me about it. So thank you to Tim, who in episode 9 picked up on a conversation I was having with Paolo Pandolfo. Now, we were talking about Jurassic Park and the guy who was working on the stop motion for Jurassic Park, and I said it was Harryhausen. Now, Harryhausen is often regarded as the sort of godfather of stop motion, but in this instance it was actually Phil Tippett, and Tim very rightly got in touch to tell me that I was wrong. So if you have any other things that you would like to tell me I've got wrong, then please feel free, podcast@larpmusic.com, and indeed if you just want to get in touch, podcast@larpmusic.com. Thank you, Tim. So what can you expect from today's chit chat with Michael Price? Well, we talk about his journey from the music department of WHSmith's in Leeds to composing for shows like Sherlock and The Unforgotten. He also reveals the challenges of composing music over multiple series. So obviously when you get a series to begin with, it's new, it's fresh, and you're sort of creating something from scratch. However, there are challenges associated with long-running series, and I think Sherlock ran to a sort of 4 series, and Unforgotten is now on series 5. So Michael talks about that. Michael also talks about the challenges associated with writing for brief for TV and film versus when he has carte blanche to write as a solo artist, and talks about how he approaches those slightly differently. He also talks very fondly of his time working with the late, great Michael Kaman, who apparently used to try and improvise action cues in a single take, something that I would love to have seen. Michael also touches on some life milestones which he feels have heavily influenced the way he writes and what he wants to write, and how he wants to be creative. And if you listen to episode 7 with Danny Mulhern, Danny talked a lot about improvisation and flow state, and Michael is also somebody who leans very heavily into improvisation and flow state in order to be at his optimal creative best. So there's some fascinating insights into Michael's writing practice there. He also shares his opinions on how far to go when creating a demo cue. I have often thought my mantra has been to sort of never allow the person listening to have to use their imagination. Michael blows that out of the water by saying actually to trust the person and not go too far down a rabbit hole has helped him hugely. So that's very interesting. And we also touch on gear and plugins. I know this is a hot topic across the internet, and Michael offers his thoughts as to whether he feels that gear and plugins can be, are they a help or are they a hindrance? As ever, all the music that we discuss can be found in the show notes on your preferred podcast platform or at larpmusic.com, and then just click on podcasts. If you enjoy the show and you have a spare moment, I would be massively grateful if you could pop on over to Apple Podcasts, rate and review the show. It just helps it reach as many people as possible. Thank you in advance for that. So without further ado, grab yourself a jammy dodger and a brew and enjoy this conversation with the wonderful Michael Price. Emmy Award-winning Michael Price has composed music for TV shows such as Sherlock, Dracula and Unforgotten. Michael has received numerous award nominations and was recently nominated for a BAFTA and an Emmy for his work on Dracula with David Arnold. His film scoring work includes titles such as Eternal Beauty, Cheerful Weather and Just Jim. But as well as being a master of music for TV and film, Michael releases music as a solo artist. His solo work takes the form of beautiful improvised piano works as heard on albums like Diary, or via the more lush grand orchestral work that you might hear on critically acclaimed releases Entanglement and Tender Symmetry, which were released on erased tapes. His latest release, The Hope of Better Weather, is rooted in the piano world but also exists as a bridge crossing into new terrain, including reworks and remixes from the likes of Jan Tiersen, Bill Ryder-Jones and Illuvium. And his forthcoming album, Whitsun, is an exploration of the connection between sound and memory. Michael Price, thanks for joining me.
Hello, Jim. It's always it does seem like a obituary rather than an introduction. The best of times.
Well, I think it's also the way that sort of also I go into a very formal voice when I read it. So rather than it's sort of like been free and easy, it's kind of like it feel like that.
No,
but
that is the rules. That there's a sort of I think we're all known, particularly for people who who've not met any of us or sort of or heard anything about us. Then there's always a sort of a shorthand, a kind of short list of things that kind of place any of us in our surroundings, and it's always sort of it's interesting what frame people see you through. So we were lucky enough to have two beautiful little kids who you may hear in the background if they're depending on what happens in the next door room. But so down at the school gate, I'm Emily's dad. It's like yes. That is the sort of number one. Number two, I'm also Henry's dad. Number three, I'm the useless one that never brings the right thing in the book bag. That's the sort of
the classic, yeah.
And so it's sort of we're always framed rather differently depending on what the circumstances are.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's actually quite a real concern of a lot of parents, is that there does seem to be almost a loss of identity because they cease to be, Michael Price. They become that person's dad. I think hopefully with everything that you've got going on in your professional career, that probably hasn't happened to you. But
Jim, I love the fact that the sort of priorities around here. I mean, it's one of the things that we did in lockdown was move out of London, where the school gate was, I have to say, was pretty much like first question was, what do you do? And we lived in a sort of slightly swanky part of London, and now we've moved out to sort of not quite the country, but it's not a million miles away. But
whereabouts are you?
We're in Hertfordshire, so we're in Berkhamsted, which is a very nice town. But at the school gate, it's sort of it feels like it's much more about the family and much more about the kids. And I think for me, maybe we'll talk about a little bit about that later. There's definitely I feel like I'm moving into a new season work-wise and in terms of my sort of the kind of music that I'm making as well. So it's I think these things are coming together at the right time.
Great. Well, that's the serendipitous sort of synchronicity, if you will. Yes, well, we'll definitely dig into that. I think the first place I'd like to start, which is where I start with everyone, is if you can sort of cast your mind back to a young Michael somewhere between the ages of 5 and 10, knocking around the mean streets of Batley.
Batley, West Yorkshire.
Yeah. If someone was to have asked you, what would you like to be when you grow up, what would you have replied?
Well, I would have definitely said from about 7 that I wanted to be a trumpet player.
Oh, okay.
Because that was the instrument that I got given, I suppose, or picked. You can never quite remember when you're a kid who did the deciding. But I played the recorder and everything, and then I got given a trumpet, and it was just like, well, this is obviously a great thing to do. This is totally brilliant, and that became sort of. Again, neither of my parents were musicians, and I got an older brother, and he got given a clarinet, and I got given a trumpet, and it just became very natural that we would play music all the time, and that's sort of back to kind of like who you are or your identity. Like I was all right at sports, so I was kind of like second 11 football and cricket, but not not like a sports star or anything. And I was all right at the academic side. But also I played music, and Yorkshire is an amazing brass playing county, and so I started to play in brass bands. There was a school brass band. Eventually I ended up playing in the Yorkshire Evening Post brass band.
Wow.
which rehearsed above a pub in Leeds, and I think I first went, I was like 12 or 13 when I got taken along to play there, and all these like proper hefty roofers and brickies who would go and drink 4 pints at the bar, go upstairs, play like angels, just beautifully, go back down, probably have another few pints, and I think almost certainly drive home as it was that sort of
back
that
in the
era.
Day. Yeah.
But yeah, so it was sort of always music, really.
So it was from the age of 7. Do you still play the trumpet, by the way? Because I didn't even know you played trumpet.
I have one.
Right,
I own
okay,
one, which is not quite the same.
Yeah, it's probably a bit like me. I have a saxophone, and I sort of remember myself from my glory days of when I was 18, and I was quite handy with it. And when I get it out of the box, I'm rubbish. I'm like, oh well, I put that back. There's no point.
It's so different, and you and I are surrounded by these extraordinary players who seem like another species.
Yeah,
and then it sits in the corner just winking at me every now and again from the studio. It's like, hey, maybe you should have another go. No.
And what was the kind of the route from that kind of epiphany at the age of 7 of sort of trumpet and going, wow, there was obviously something there where you said, wow, music is special, and then you sort of doing sort of these bands up through into your teens. Because there was an interview with Edith on soundtracking, which I loved, when you sort of said at one point you went home and your dad had put the Evening Post out on the table and he'd circled some jobs for you, because it sounded like you were maybe sort of entertaining the idea of music, but he's like, come on, get yourself a proper job. Which is, I keep coming back to this because I always feel that music was never presented to me up north as a viable career. It was something nice to do and, have some fun, but, get yourself a proper job at the end of the day. So how did that kind of graduation work from discovery of music to sort of then becoming a professional composer?
I genuinely think that there was a series of stumbling discoveries, a bit like a sort of somebody blundering round an old warehouse in the dark, with just sort of tripping over things and then falling through a door by accident. In that, when I was at school, there was nobody I knew worked in the media. Then I went to university and did a course called the Tonmeister course at Surrey University, which is a music and sound recording thing. And that was more connected with places like the BBC and studios if you're going to go in and be a recording engineer, which I loved. But I just always thought that the kind of itch to write music wasn't really going away. I had no application for it. And then really sort of in my 20s, it was through being bad at several things. I got a job in WHSmith's in the record department out of the Yorkshire Evening Post, thanks to my dad, deputy department manager, I'll have you know. But I was terrible. I was just awful. There were people who were demonstrably better at being deputy department manager of WHSmith's record department in Leeds than I was, and so it was sort of. I met a few people along the way who've just very kindly fired me from jobs. It was never done in sort of anger or anything other than, I would sit down in the boss's office and they would say, we both know this isn't for you. This isn't what you should be doing. And then I think the two sort of seminal accidental moments was I found myself living in Cambridge very cheaply, just in a shared house, and I saw an advert from Ben and Jonathan Finn, who wrote Sibelius software, the music notation package, and at that point the company consisted of the two brothers. It was an absolute startup working from Ben's flat, and they were looking for somebody who knew a bit about the fledgling music technology to put things in envelopes for them and help out. And so I went along, started helping Ben and Jonathan out with Sibelius, and then I started training people on it, and went around doing demos and trade shows, and those sort of tired looking people that you see if you ever go to one of those music trade shows who was stood there for like what feels like 36 hours handing out leaflets. That was me. And through that, again, utterly sort of by chance, I found myself doing demos down at the Royal Academy on a Sunday morning. And Michael Kaman, who late great wonderful film composer who had an association with the Academy, was looking for a new assistant. He had a relatively high burn rate of assistants, as is the case with many of these charismatic and quixotic personalities. And so I just, myself and another wonderful composer called James Brett, the two of us were sort of accidentally turned up on a Monday morning at Michael's house. Both of us had been asked to come and be an assistant. Neither of us knew that the other one had been asked. So there were sort of two of us awkwardly standing there going, why are you here? I'm here to be an assistant. We turned up on Monday. Michael turned up on Thursday. That's the latest I've ever seen anybody be.
Yeah, that's pretty late. 4 days.
Already setting the tone for what was to come.
Yeah.
And that was a sort of, it was like accidentally stepping through whatever platform it is in Harry Potter, 10.5 or something.
9 3/4.
9 3/4, that's it. Platform 9 3/4, and going to our version of Hogwarts, which was spending kind of half the year in LA with Michael and half the year in London, working on these insanely big films, but absolutely accidentally.
Yeah. And you mentioned that he had a high burn rate. What was the difference between those that had come and gone very quickly before and you that seemed to sort of manage to stick it out and stay the course?
Yeah, I did. I sort of thought about this a bit in the past, particularly with the people that I would come to ask to help me out. What were those characteristics? And I don't think it's sort of false modesty to say it was never down to my extraordinary skills. I think, I met people who are much, much better musicians and much better with the technology and much, for every sort of aspect of the work that you could imagine, I knew people who were better at it than me. But perhaps there was something about a kind of a sort of, I'm quite diligent. I work quite hard. I like to see things finished, and so I will be there first and in the studio, and I will be there clearing up afterwards with everybody else last. And I do like, I kind of like to start jobs as well as I can, and then like to get all the way through to the end of it and finish things properly. And that sort of, I think perhaps that side of my character matched up with Michael Kaman's much more sort of improvised way of doing things. And so I think in a way the fact that myself and James could provide some structure around him, and then Michael could be really free and just do what he liked. I think that seemed to work out. Yeah,
that's interesting. It's the kind of, I often ask myself that as well, in terms of how much of success is based around sort of actual skills versus competencies or character, and obviously there was a working relationship which you solved problems for Michael in a way that sort of suited him and also didn't ruffle your feathers. And it sounds like as well, back to the days when you were sort of working with these guys on Sibelius, you're not afraid to get your hands dirty and just muck in. There's no sort of expectation of like, I'm above this. It's like, no, job's got to get done. We dig in and get it done. And maybe that does go all the way back to working in Smiths and catching the bus at 6:30 in the morning. It was sort of, it's always, I'm 52 now. I've been, so it's not quite 30 years since I met Michael, but sort of 27 years, something like that. And in that time, I don't think there's ever been a moment where I've kind of thought, I'm kind of like, I'm too good for this bit. Like I live in a state of of constant amazement, basically. Not always good amazement, but certainly amazement of some kind or other that this is, that this is what's happening around me, and that I get to be part of it. Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is a privilege to get to do what you love, to earn a living. Okay, well, that's probably an excellent sort of segue into going under the skin. Under the skin. we're kind of interested in the sort of two aspects. Is one, the sort of the professional side of things, of sort of composing for film and TV, but then also the crossover of doing your own solo work. Because I think with this podcast, one of the things I'm really interested in is people's creative process and how that changes. And I think by sharing sort of ideas and understanding other people's creative processes, that can sort of help us. So we're going to sort of have a chat about Unforgotten. So I'd sort of love to know kind of like when that comes through the door and it's on, season 4 or 5 now.
Well, we're just starting season 5. It's very topical. As literally last night, as we're recording this, last night we were at the Royal Television Society Awards, where season 4 was nominated for Best Drama but didn't win, and so we're all a little bit sad this morning until the BAFTA nominations were announced 3 hours ago, and it's been nominated for Best Drama in BAFTAs as well. So we're happy again.
Amazing.
A little hungover.
Well, it's funny as well, because the idea that it didn't win, commiserations, but at the same time you were classed in the sort of like the highest echelon of TV drama awards
in a very strong year. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
It's like, I only came 4th in the Olympics. It's like, I'd like to win a medal, but still I am one of the 4th best in the world at my discipline. So amazing. Yeah. So I think with Unforgotten, what's kind of interesting is obviously now starting season 5, and I think how does the process change from the kind of first time the sort of season 1 came and it's the first time you're doing it versus now sort of season 5, where you've got your established motifs and themes and you know what's happening?
Totally. I feel like there's having done Sherlock in the past, which ran to 4 seasons and over the course of sort of 10 years, and now having another show that I'm lucky enough to write for that is running. I think we've been doing this 8 years now, 7 or 8 years. It is that you get to experience the subtle differences and the nuance of how a particular series and the character of that series changes over time, which I'm fascinated with. So some of my favourite shows, Inspector Morse, a bunch of the sort of like long running classic TV shows, they change because of all sorts of very human reasons. That the cast age in front of you. In the case of Unforgotten, we've got a new, one of our lead characters died at the end of season 4, so there's a new actress and a new character in season 5, and there's a sort of you live with not just the sort of artistic choices, but you live with sort of very human choices. We all age as we're doing it. It's like a sort of long running TV series. I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of our culture in that in various layers, real life is happening as the story is changing. So the trajectory of Sherlock was one of sort of expansion, if you like, and so each time we came back to do another series, somehow it seemed bigger, somehow it seemed slightly more fantastical, somehow, and so musically, David Arnold and I that write Sherlock would find ourselves sort of expanding to meet that, and so it was bigger and more, and sort of just throw as much as we could to make these sort of wonderful spectacles. With Unforgotten, it's a very different feeling. The show itself its great strength, I think, is in the writing and the performances, quite naturalistic performances. It's all been directed by Andy Wilson, by the same director, every frame of it, over all 4 seasons, and you can tell because all the supporting cast are allowed to be brilliant. They're always brilliant actors anyway, but you need a great director to be able to frame that so that they can perform well. And so the music for Unforgotten has become a musical frame for those very human performances to exist within. And when we were doing the first season, sort of trying to explore how it would work, I wrote a bunch of music for it that I thought at the time was attached to particular characters, because for those who haven't seen the show, it's a sort of a similar setup each time. There's a number of characters who could potentially be the murderer or the villain or the but we find out that the interest is that we find out a lot about each of the characters that we're seeing and about their lives, and we find out that everybody has got some secrets, and that actually, even though there is a sort of a crime to be solved, that again, we're finding out about the true nature of people. And so then when it came to season 2, I started by writing a bunch of new themes, because I thought, well, actually, it's a different person on the screen. It's a different set of characters. So everybody should have a different theme, a sort of person attached to the person theme. And we all, myself and Andy and Chris Lang, who's the writer exec, all the execs, we all watched it, and it was roundly dismissed as being like, what are you doing? Why doesn't it sound like Unforgotten anymore? And I explained myself and kind of, well, I've done this because of this reason and that because, and the room just went, no, I don't think so. Can we try sort of using, not exactly the same, but can we try using the themes that were developed from the first season? And in my head, I'd gone, well, that's attached to that character, but then when you take it to one level of abstraction and say, well, actually that's really about anger, that is an anger theme, and that is a hope theme, and that is a theme about loneliness or human connection or sort of tenderness, and then you start to rebuild the score around those ideas, you get this incredible, I mean, I didn't think of it, as always, I'm last to the party, but you get this incredible kind of framing effect of connecting together people, because rather than it being a bit sort of Lord of the Rings, as we used to, bless it, I was a music editor on Lord of the Rings, and lots of the sort of slightly dark late night humour is always generated on difficult shows, and on that it was kind of see Hobbit, play Hobbit. So it's kind of, which Howard Shaw obviously did absolutely beautifully, but there's a sense of those character driven things where you're playing tunes for people, but on Unforgotten we play tunes for emotional ideas, and now having done that for 4 seasons, you start to build up this unconscious set of associations, I think, or sort of expectations where you start to you can hear some sort of tender music played behind a character who's very unlikable at that time, might be doing something really not at their best, but then the whole show becomes sort of framed in this humanity. So again, we'll try with season 5 and see how much has to change, but I think it will be more about trying to make sure that the new character is framed within what we know to be the world of Unforgotten, this very humane world.
So presumably that first series, your kind of creative direction is you very much looking at those characters and going, okay, thinking thematically on a character by character basis. But then obviously those characters change. When you say that those themes changed, how were you trying to change? I mean, were they radically different? You sort of try and, well, hey, let's try some dubstep for this character, or was it? I mean, it was obviously something that the execs picked up on, so it wasn't super subtle, because I sort of think if it was, that they might not have noticed, and it would have retained that feel.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, they are very, very musically and emotionally literate, the team at Unforgotten, so they do notice rightly. I think it's almost that they're very emotionally honest about their response to what I'm doing, which is sometimes bruising in the moment, but is always better. The palette was kind of set from the start, really. So strings and me playing the piano, and Peter Gregson's beautiful cello solos over the top, and some sort of ethereal sound design. But it's really the strings of piano and cello that are the heart of it. But you sort of, there's a kind of I think that the character of certain music, when you zoom right into it, it becomes impossible to sort of to discern. A little bit like getting too close to a kind of pixelated picture. It's like, well, I don't know what this is. This could be anything, and it's not really until you zoom out and see the whole that you kind of go, oh, that is clearly Unforgotten. That's clearly Game of Thrones. That's clearly whatever it is, and so you're reliant on your own instinct and the instinct of the program makers to be able to, in the moment, go, oh, I don't think that's very Unforgotten. And if you ask them or myself to define why it's not, we're kind of, it's hard to do that. But you know that when you stack up a bunch of cues in a row, does it feel like we're watching Unforgotten? So yeah, there's a lot of sort of instinct first, and then it's always the composer's job to make that work.
I suppose, is that something that you find as well, is sort of when you're knee deep in a project and you're sort of, working hours every day to sort of get it done, is it sometimes difficult to sort of have that, almost as you described, like this macro overview of the whole, because you're so, I think this is, as a mix engineer and as a composer, that's one of the difficulties, but do you find it difficult yourself sometimes to have that perspective when you're sort of like knee deep in it?
Absolutely, always. Literally, the sort of, I don't, it's not even until I watch the final broadcast of, or go and see the premiere of a film, that I really get a sense, because then you're watching the whole thing as a viewer, as a keen viewer of all kinds of things myself, and it's a different headspace. You're hearing the music in a very different way, and there've been innumerable times when I've listened to something on the telly and just put my head in my hands and just go, oh no, that's not what I meant. And it's sort of, and it's entirely down to me. I'm sort of not bitching about the dub levels or any of these kind of things. It's you've put your finger on the kind of hard bit of the job, and it doesn't always work. Sort of stepping back and seeing a 2-hour film or a 6-10 episode series and perceiving how it's working is incredibly difficult, but I guess if you could work out the formula, or if it was easy, then there'd be no challenge. So it's sort of
quite
worth doing.
And I suppose that's where the value of good execs come in, is because they're providing the perspective that you don't have, and it's something that Stephen Warbeck touched on in one of the first episode, was that it's very much a collaborative process, and their feedback and their sort of overview. And he was talking in relation to a sort of director who had a sort of very specific sort of creative vision, but it's the same idea that they provide a perspective which then maybe pushes you or nudges you in a direction that you otherwise wouldn't have taken. So in terms of sort of like a creative exploration, it's actually sort of sometimes beneficial to receive negative feedback.
I am totally there for feedback. It's sort of, obviously, I'm not ego free as I don't think any of us are, and so it can be. You'd like everybody to say that you liked everything that they sent. That's your default position. But there've been, I think, in sort of 30 years, there's only been a handful of times when I've felt that the feedback was not in good faith. Like 99% of the feedback I've ever had, which has been a considerable amount, has been in good faith from people wanting to make things better. And if you can sort of really let that kind of settle in and slightly get over, I've done some practical things over the years to try and encourage that thinking within myself. For instance, I used to mentally finish something before I would send it, and that might consist of sort of maybe doing a one-more mix pass on a demo, or sort of kind of getting in a player or two on, this is in sort of on working demos that would be either expensive or sort of time consuming to replace. So it's sort of finish things, and if you've mentally shut down on it, it's like, well, this is what it is, and you send it to somebody who's got an opinion on it, and their opinion is that maybe it should be slower or faster, the sort of thing that to people who are not involved in recording real instruments don't realise that might be quite challenging. And so I don't do that anymore. I try and sort of keep things as open as I can at every point in the process, which takes a degree of trust. So my demos, sort of for approval, some of them from time to time are like quite ropey, because it's sort of, in order to demonstrate the thing that I want to demonstrate, I would have either have to record it. I mean, there's for instance, there was a cue in I think probably the last season of Sherlock that relied very much on a beautiful violin solo over the top of it. Now, either we recorded the beautiful violin solo, in which case it was finished, or I demoed it and said, this will be a beautiful violin solo. It sounds like crap right now, but this is where we're thinking. And so I think when you keep your processes open and keep your mental, it's one of the questions that I ask back to people if they send me any music, which I don't encourage. Don't send me anything.
Do not do that.
I've got nothing to say. If anybody does send me anything, I always ask them first to say, where are you with this? Have you released this? Is it finished? Because if it's finished and emotionally you're finished with it, the only thing I'm ever going to say to you is, well done. I think it's great. If it is open and there's things that you can do and you're asking for any input onto the next stage, which you can do something about, then that's a different conversation. But
it's interesting. That's fascinating what you're saying, Michael, because I've always had a motto when I'm sending off demos is, don't make them use their imagination. Like, don't send something and go, hey, this will be amazing. Once I've got a real orchestra in there and and I've got all these instruments in there, it'll be amazing. But what you're saying as well is that actually possibly we as musicians are scrutinizing this, because it's our own work as well. We're scrutinizing it to a level that other people will probably not scrutinize it to. They're not listening to the mixing quite the same way. They're not listening to the production elements. They're probably, first and foremost, it's like it's an initial a reaction. It's an emotion. It's like, how does this make me feel? So trust, and as you say, it's a trust thing. It's trusting them to be able to hear beyond the ropey demo. And the thing is as well, is like what we class as ropey, someone else might go, oh wow, is that a real violin? No,
exactly.
No, that's a Logic legato patch, and it sounds nothing like a real violin, by the way. So yeah, I think that's very fascinating, because I think I probably have a tendency to go too far down that rabbit hole of trying to make it perfect before sending it, whereas actually, but as you say, is like, if it's not quite right, then going back is an absolute nightmare. And also what you're saying as well is like, psychologically, you've finished it. So for someone to come back with changes, you're like, what do you mean? We're not. This is finished. Why would I want to change it and edit it? This is done. Whereas actually, if you're sending a demo with open to collaboration, it's much more in the spirit of, hey, what do you think of this? Let's bounce it around, and you're in a mind state to possibly receive that feedback and critique more so than if you spent several grand on sort of session musicians.
I mean, I have to say, I only have come to these conclusions by making every mistake that is possible. Over the years. In fact, I can remember I did a film, a beautiful Danish film. It must be about 15 years ago now. It's quite a while. When early on, and I was very anxious, like everybody would be with the sort of early films. And the director, it'd been a very fastidious, beautiful process. It was a film made by Zentropa, that's Lars von Trier's film production company out in Denmark. So, a beautiful sort of art house tradition. And I thought everything had been signed off. It was the Thursday we were in Abbey Road. On the Friday, everything was at the copyist. It was all we were all there to go. And the director, who's an absolutely charming man and a great artist, rang me up, and he knew I would be not happy, but he said that he didn't think the end title cue was working. And I had closed every possible thing, and I was so frustrated and so cross. I can remember now having to go, I need to go for a walk, I'll call you back in an hour. And I was just sort of, every part of my insecurity about what I'd be able to do and how it was all going to work was just sort of exploded in the moment by that call from a very gentle and kind and lovely filmmaker. And, I walked around the block and took a deep breath and went back. And of course I could change it. And of course it was fine. And of course, and we got there in the end. But I think just for my own blood pressure now, I just miss out that middle bit.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's it. What is experience but a series of mistakes from which we learn. And it's
many more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think you kind of learn more from the failures than you do the wins, because you get a win and it's like, right, on to the next without really giving it too much thought. Yeah. Whereas when a failure, you sit and brood on it for days, weeks, months, and then actually sort of come around and go, actually, yeah, I see that now with that perspective.
Totally.
So that we've talked about the Unforgotten, and then in terms of your solo stuff, when you're sitting down to do a solo project, so take for example The Hope of Better Weather, how is your process different? Because obviously with a TV, quite often you're probably getting visuals, so you've got the visuals to work from, the story, if it's a film you've got a script depending on what stage you're involved. Obviously with your own solo stuff you've got carte blanche, so where do you start?
I think there's a sort of in my mind, I've got this kind of three-legged stool of music, like a kind of milkmaid stool. So apparently three-legged stools are more stable than four-legged ones. There's something about if it's on an uneven floor. I'm not sure that's right. But anyway, for me, it's sort of the music that I make is either film and TV scores or sort of media type things. That's one. Or then orchestral, classical, recorded type of projects, probably at a bigger scale, and then piano, which is my sort of improvised diary keeping kind of place. It's sort of, in a way, the piano part of those three things is like, I'm not as, we both know extraordinary concert pianists and people who are sort of amazing performers, and for me, piano is not that, particularly because I am not that. It's sort of like a real-time version of the creative process. So improvisation's been something that I've always done somehow. I'm never quite sure when I started doing it, but in my at uni and then in my early 20s, I used to play the piano for contemporary dance classes, which was all improvised. And so you would just sort of, they'd count you, the teacher would count you in, so 6, 7, 8, and off you go. You'd play until everybody stopped, and then you'd play something different. And so there's a sort of these three different disciplines of scoring, as you described, to sort of pre-existing story. There's a pre-existing scene. You're sort of, in a way, at some point trying to solve a very big crossword puzzle. There's the classical, if you like, pen and paper architecture building music that I love to do, which almost always I will start. I've got pile after pile of manuscript paper and books. Obviously, I'm a bit of a stationery. I have a weakness for stationery. so if I see a manuscript book with a nice leather cover anywhere in the world, that will be mine. It will be coming home. And in these books, I sort of fill with ideas, anything that I see, either whether it's a piece of art, so a painting, or whether it's a story, or whether it's some poetry, or a character, or an idea. So I collect these so that when I'm ready to put together a classical project, then I've got a sort of scrapbook of material. And then with the piano, things that start from the piano, it literally starts from home. It's the most sort of intimate, really, and vulnerable place, because I'm slightly protected in the other two. So in film and TV, I'm kind of protected by the structure, and it's slightly. I mean, most film and TV music, the success of it stands and falls on whether the program or the film does well, and you can hide behind that a bit. And if you do sort of larger scale classical stuff for orchestra, you're slightly protected behind the fact that everybody's playing it so beautifully, and it's kind of there's a certain mystery to it. It looks like you're clever even when you're really not, and there's something there. But then playing the piano, there's just neither of those. When you're improvising, it's just sort of like in real time. So I'm fascinated by that, but I'm fascinated by those three things and kind of keeping turning the wheel, because I don't think I could just do any one of them.
Isn't you're exposed, aren't you? When it's just you and a piano, you're exposed in a way that you're not. I always found that as when I dabbled as a singer-songwriter, when I was playing solo guitar and singing, I felt much more exposed. When I had a band, and it was great, and then get on stage as part of a stage show, and it's great because nobody's looking at the band anyway; they're all looking at the actors. So it's like, oh, this is so much more relaxing than if it's just me on my own. But that kind of improvisational approach? Do you also approach scoring? Will you have a scene in front of you and watch that and sort of improvise around that? And how much then are you sort of reliant on the visuals, or will at some point you sort of switch the scene off and work on that? Tapping in what you were saying before about finding an emotion and tapping into that. Because I sometimes find that I get very distracted by visuals, and I'm sticking to it so rigidly that I'm sort of losing it. I'm intellectualizing it too much rather than feeling it. Yeah,
it's a really good way of describing it, Jim, because it's, for me, the sort of whatever skills that I sort of developed in either the improvisation world or the kind of structural architectural composition world, when I'm in a film and TV situation, I think that's what's developed over the years, is that they're sort of, that certain amount of technique is there to choose from, and then I feel like often my job these days is more about choosing the right way to do something for myself than it is necessarily about exactly what it is I'm doing. In that, if I choose, so for instance, I mean, again, thinking about the late Michael Kaman, who comes up in my thoughts so much, I think, when I'm talking about these sort of things. He was an amazing improviser. But he got no patience at all. So he used to want to improvise action cues. And it was just like, oh, Michael, let's not do this. And he wanted to improvise like a 5-minute cue in one take every time. And so he wouldn't sort of stop and go, oh, I've got the first minute and a half, okay, we can go from there. It's like, no, he wanted to go all the way back to the start.
Switching time signatures, 7/8, 5/8, 4/4.
Oh, just, and it was, when he did it right, it was extraordinary to behold. But obviously there were many times when it didn't quite come off. So if there is let's say an action cue, then a structural approach to that works really well. You've got to do the maths. You've got to find out where it's going to go. You don't want to sort of write yourself into a corner, so don't start too fast. All this, that technical stuff starts to happen. But then an underscore cue, particularly if there's been sort of, if what the characters are talking about has got strong emotional content, which is almost all the time in the sort of dramas that we do, then for me the very best way to try and underscore that scene is to play along, and then it's immediately obvious from being like a dance accompanist. It's immediately obvious if you're overplaying. You just I embarrass myself in this. It's like, oh, stop it! That's much too much. And then you can breathe with the actors. You can breathe with the performances. But 9 times out of 10, when it's going wrong for me, it's because I've chosen the wrong approach in the first place. I've started improvising when I should have been doing some structure. I've started mapping things out too early when I should just be finding. I mean, sometimes it's because I've not got strong enough thematic material, and so I start structuring something out, and 3/4 of the way through, you kind of go, it just hasn't got a good tune. I haven't got a tune that I can play right now, and those can be difficult days, because like playing a really good tune that has been set up for the rest of the film for this one big moment is either one of life's ecstatic glories, or if it's not going well and you haven't got the tune, it's not working, it's just a dagger to the heart. It's very obvious to everybody.
Yeah, well, and that feeds in as well to what you were saying before about that's when being able to sort of step back and see the whole. Is that when you can sort of go, actually, do you know what, I've been approaching this wrong from the start? Because when you're in the thick of it, you're like, it's not working, but why? And you sort of just keep plugging away, and you're sort of like, if I flog this horse long enough, I will get something out of it. But actually, if you can sort of step back, you sort of have this moment of realization. It's like, okay, well, my approach has been wrong from the start. So that again just sort of highlights the importance of that perspective. And you know, you was talking about as well when you sort of sit down at home on the piano. Do you find that technology is incredible, and I always cite technology, you know, I think it sounds like you're much more comfortable with manuscript paper. I mean, I need to hear it to know that it works. So technology has provided that for me. I wouldn't be able to sort of work in a world where we were still working with sort of manuscript paper. So technology is incredible, but do you also sometimes find it restrictive in a way where you're actually, when you're sitting down at a piano and there's no click track and you're not sort of mapping things out, that there's a certain freedom that comes with that?
Absolutely. And it's, I mean, I've kind of going through a bit of I was talking about moving house, I think, earlier before we started, and we've moved out of London, out to the country, and I haven't got, well, there still is a big fancy studio in London, but I haven't been to it for months and months. I've got a little study in the converted garage of our house, and I'm trying to create the conditions for that mental exploration that isn't driven by the technology. It's not sort of pre-gridded. And that's not to say that I haven't, you know, I've got computers in here, and, you know, I'm going to do this year's TV scoring in here. You know, I have a few exquisite pieces of outboard. If anybody's complaining that the quality is going to drop, such thing, but it's just the idea of creating conditions for my own freedom of thought and expression, and I'm actually really excited about that. I used to be excited about gear and technology because, like you described very well, the ability to hear and create the actual noises that move people on the computer, and to be able to sort of write for multiple instruments, and all of that was absolute witchcraft when we first started to do it, and I found it so fascinating, and so I still appreciate how engaging it is for other people. But for me, I'm moving, I think, into a slightly new phase where I'm excited by the opportunity to try and think, and there might be nothing in there, Jim. You know, I might be scraping about in an empty old biscuit tin, but we're sort of, none of us are going to be around forever, and I think I'd be sort of gently disappointed in myself if I, got to a point when I wasn't really working so much anymore, and I hadn't given myself, created the conditions where I could try and think up my best stuff.
No, absolutely. I would be very surprised if you are scraping biscuits, and I think that resonates hugely with me, to the point I actually on Monday released a musical musing, which is just basically kind of thoughts as I have them. And one of the things that I touched on that in that was creating from the heart rather than creating from the head.
Wonderful.
This idea that, and I think this ties into what you're saying about gear. I've seen your studio, and because it's funny when you said you had a stationary fetish, I was like, well, that's at least two then, because you've got a gear fetish as well. But I also read there's a post on your blog as well where you talk about, you've sort of kind of touched on this, about the sort of like the tendency is to sort of get distracted by sort of flashing lights and what have you, whereas actually, you know, particularly, I think music, any kind of music is this, particularly music for TV and film, but it's all about trying to elicit emotion in the listener and the viewer. And what better way to do that than try and imbue your creation with as much emotion as possible? And if you are drawing on your own emotion and you're getting in touch with that emotion when you create, I think that goes a long way to creating something which is going to more likely to move someone emotionally. And then actually, so with taking away all these sort of distractions of gear, and I don't have a fetish quite like yours, but I do. there's very few things that get me excited, but buying a new bit of gear does. But actually, just sort of getting back and actually focusing in on it, you know, the starting point is like, where are you creating from and how are you creating? I think that's possibly where the greatest reward lies.
I couldn't agree more, and I have some other thoughts about the sort of commoditization, if that's even a word, of what we do, which is in terms of the bits of it that can be easily packaged up, and we can have things sold to us that we are told will make us feel better. They're just obviously the bits that are going to receive the most sort of commercial support, because there are businesses to be had from selling us things that we think will make us either get more work or be better at the work that we're getting. And I don't resent any of that. Everybody's, you know, trying to feed their families, but I think actually the stuff that's important for me right now is not something that can be sold to me. So there's not another plug-in that can make me take a walk up in the fields. There's not a sort of a particular piece of gear that will create the conditions for me to freely explore, either on a piece of paper or the piano or just in my mind, an idea. And in fact, the opposite is true, because almost always to buy a piece of gear, whatever your personal circumstances are, you're really trading that. You need to earn that money somehow, so that takes time. So the thing that you're trading is your time for that particular thing, and I'm massively aware of the deep hypocrisy of somebody like me with a ridiculous studio going, oh, it's not really important, it's just go for a walk. But I'd like to frame it rather as not necessarily as hypocrisy, but just as a journey where it's sort of that stuff was so, and still is, incredibly engaging to be surrounded by gear that has got a story and has been often handmade, or, you know, made with a great deal of care and design, and often that does sound extraordinary. I mean, you can, you know, it's not all smoke and mirrors. You know, some things to my ears sound better than other things, and I'm interested in that. But now I'm interested in I think in the American Senate or Congress, they have an expression of reclaiming my time. And I think that's when one of the senators asks a question and the person is not answering it, they get to claim their time back so they can do something else. And I think I am reclaiming my time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that in mind, then, so the gear is no longer providing the impetus, but so for projects like The Hope of Better Weather and your forthcoming album Whitsun, where does the inspiration start for that? Is that kind of starting in the fields of
Burke said, that's it, sunny hearts. The Hope of Better Weather for me has been about people. So it's sort of been a kind of a door opener in a way to a slightly new way of working, in that the album has got my original piano improvisations from 10 years ago. So which is sort of, it's slightly spooky hearing them, because it's literally it's like a little time capsule. It was your fingers from 10 years ago. That was actually, sort of the humanity of the sort of 10-year-old, a 10-year younger person is built in there. And I was trying to find a way to, I think, kind of create the conditions for me to move forward. And so by approaching a group of artists, all of whose work I really admired, lots of different people, and then giving them permission to just do what they wanted, to be absolutely free. I think not only then produced these amazing remixes and sort of had a life of its own, particularly, I mean, Bill Ryder Jones wrote this heartbreaking song, just so beautiful, based on one of the piano pieces, and then I played it back to him. So I sort of did a piano version of his song, which is based on my piano thing in the first place, and I think there's been a process of sort of like of freedom, and so then the Hope of Better Weather as an album is really about sort of like, when you start from an improvisation, where can you go? And there are sort of like 4 or 5 examples on there of the many directions that you could take. And I think then that sort of has opened the door for what's next for me. So I have got this project called Whitson, which there'll be sort of more to come this year, as they say in all the dodgy trailers. But that was, I think, in hindsight, that was then me doing this whole process myself. So I decided to make something very personal, based on some family stories. And my grandfather died a few years ago, who was a very sort of influential figure in our family. And I was sent some photos of him and my grandma and my mum when my mum was had just been born. And these pictures are from 1939, just before war broke out, and they're on the beach at Scarborough. And it's sort of it's quintessentially 1930s and Yorkshire, and also the handwriting underneath says that war is about to break out in like 3 months' time, and they're my grandparents sort of holding my mum between them on the beach. So I was very struck by this. So I started making something that had got was me playing the piano and doing a little bit of singing, heavily treated, and playing a tiny little bit of trumpet in there as well. Just doing
I would love to hear your voice auto-tuned.
It's the only way anybody ever will.
It sound like T-Pain. T-Pain at the piano.
Exactly. Not a natural singer, Jim, and not like your good self. And then I built this little very intimate musical world that's become this album. And then sadly my dad died last year in the middle of making it, and that took on a whole new sort of symbolism, if you like, or a sense of sort of memories and casting memories backwards and forwards. So it's sort of that's in the process of being finished off now, but I think Hope of Better Weather was the door that was open to let me do Whitson, I think, in my own head.
Getting a taste. It mentions on your Biog that Whitson is a sort of an exploration connecting between sound and memory, and I've always sort of marveled at how music has this incredible ability to spark very, very vivid memories. I mean, so does sort of smell, but particularly music. I can listen to a piece of music and it will transport me back to a particular day, particular time. I was doing it at a particular age and I can remember it very vividly. I always think creatively we are shaped by everything that's come before and what we've been exposed to and consumed. Are there specific kind of, it could be albums, it could be songs, it could be film scores, it could be anything, but specific sort of milestones in music which you can identify, which you feel have had a profound influence on shaping who you are as creative today?
Totally. I mean, it's sort of almost every day since I could remember, there's been something musical that has informed that day and has coloured it. So you're sort of looking back to see the really big ones. I can remember hearing Keith Jarrett Clone concert first of all, and that I think the things that are really memorable for me are things that open up a whole world. It's like, is this possible? How is this a thing? So Keith Jarrett, one of the finest jazz pianists that's ever been, all round amazing musician, was known for this series of improvised concerts that he was doing in the 70s and continued until very recently, and he just turned up at a venue and played for people, and the entire thing was improvised. And this sort of, when I was starting to improvise, I wasn't sure whether we were allowed to do this, whether it was just something that stayed in the dance studio, whether people would actually listen to it. And so somebody went, "Oh, you have to listen to this," and of course I thought I was the first person that had found it, and everybody else was going, "Yeah, mate, that was the best-selling piano record ever." In this, like, everybody else has got it. But there's something extraordinary when I still listen to that so much now, and I feel like I remember every other time that I've listened to it, which is hundreds and hundreds of times, and because it feels like an act of creation in real time. It's that the extraordinary thing where you can sort of feel him reaching for something, and it's taking its time, and then the sort of dam breaks and he finds the place that he wanted to go to, or he sort of surprises himself. It's an extraordinary record. I got a transcription once and started to try and learn it, and then decided that was utterly missing the point of it. Like, that's not what this is. Yeah. And so that opened the door for piano playing. I think classical, the first time I heard like John Tavener's Protecting Veil, there's basically, for someone of my disposition, Sir John Tavener and Arvo Pärt are the sort of mothership of people who feel like they have created an environment where they've made permission for themselves to express, for both of them, spiritual thoughts. Now, I'm not a religious person, but there's a sort of permission that I'm giving myself more and more now to let music explore thoughts of sort of humanity, spirituality, perhaps in general, rather than specific for me. And so I'd always associate that with sort of like non-living people. I mean, obviously John Tavener died, but the sort of, yes, you can hear Bach and kind of go, oh, that's spiritual music. But it felt for a long time that was sort of old music, and we weren't allowed to do that anymore. So hearing the Protecting Veil is this extraordinary cello and orchestra piece where the cello is like just up in the heavens all the way through. It's the most affecting and sort of emotionally vivid piece, and again remember that opening a door, and then in really different ways about identity. When I was a kid in Batley, we were this weird hybrid of goths and new romantics, and slightly punk as well, and we didn't know what we were doing, so we dressed in stuff we got off Leeds Market, and there was a lot of dodgy hairspray colours, and there was it was all of that. And so the Japan record Ghosts was for me extraordinary. I don't think you could probably hear much of sort of David Sylvian and the band directly in the music that I write now, but at the time I attached to this idea of sort of music being something that sort of expressed an identity and almost like created an identity. It sort of had this feedback loop where here were people who were sort of, for a small town boy from Batley, he was this sort of exotic sounding, kind of fluid world where the music was the reason for it, and the sort of fashion and the the kind of lifestyle sort of clubbing stuff that was around it, but it was the music was central to it. So whenever I hear, I mean, I've got a copy on vinyl, of course, now because I'm middle-aged, so that's the rules. But when I do put it on from time to time, and it's like, oh, that is a direct hit back to being a teenager.
So that where you're talking about there, so like obviously that it sounds like it was kind of part of the kind of punk goth movement, but you feel that was very much it was the music first, and all the bells and whistles around it came afterwards, which is quite interesting because I sometimes have a maybe slightly cynical view of a lot of particularly modern music, whereby it's all the glitz and glam that comes first, and actually then the music is just in a world where it's all about fame and celebrity. It's kind of all of the sort of the icing is the main bit, and actually the cake itself is just a sort of crumb at the bottom that sort of everybody's forgotten about.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, touching on so being part of the Sherlock family for 10 years and meeting either online or in the flesh sometimes, people who connected to the show in the way that I connected to music when I was a teenager, then the depth of that, the how meaningful in that case a TV show is to people is something that I think sometimes we can particularly if it's either music or film and TV that we as perhaps in my case certainly as an older person don't get. It's like, I don't like that. I don't understand why there's anything in that. But if there is a connection, if someone finds a connection in it, I think particularly in your sort of teenage years, these are heartfelt and true connections. And I think we sort of what's that expression on treading on people's dreams? It's sort of, I'm always hugely respectful about that because I remember what I was like, and it was really important to me.
And what about, I mean, when you're growing up, was there sort of particular film soundtracks or film TV composers that you cite? I've had a conversation with a guy called Paolo Pandolfo in an episode. He's an editor, and he talks about Jurassic Park being for him this sort of epiphany, sort of visual epiphany, like moment where he was like, wow. And I often talk about Star Wars, I think, being for me, and what I think at the time is, I had VHS cassette which was just worn out because I think I probably watched it every day at some point. I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. But I think actually a part of that was the music. I think I didn't appreciate at the time that John Williams and his scores was somehow having this kind of profound effect on me, which I didn't kind of realize at the time. But are there certain films or certain scores that you can sort of remember as sort of just blowing your mind in that same way that sort of Japan did?
Do you know, I hear a lot of my colleagues, and they're describing from whatever vintage that there's these really sort of strong experiences in the cinema. Often, like say Star Wars, John Williams features heavily on that list. I think for a lot of us, obviously a master. But I think my life was much more parochial and sort of smaller. I think, I remember Coronation Street. I remember the sort of I remember the sort of film and telly that I consumed until really maybe going away from home to uni was what we watched as a family, or what I remember watching Minder, or it's like stuff that's and so there's a sort of I don't know whether subconsciously it's why I've ended up doing a lot of telly, but that sense of, like, I did like going to the cinema, but it felt so remote. Like I didn't make any connection between what I was doing playing in the brass band with what Star Wars was. I just didn't, I didn't join the dots. I joined the dots with my friends and where we used to get up to on the Saturday night and the clubs we used to go to, and that's sort of like, and that's starting to express through music. Your kind of identity, and then it was sort of, I think really, I worked in a recording studio for a year when I was halfway through uni, and I met a film composer and film TV composer, a guy called Nick Beaker, and he is possibly the most urbane and wonderful and generous and kind man that I've met in the whole of the industry. And he slightly took me under his wing. You probably might deny it, but I felt he did. And he had a wonderful and beautiful wife and great. He has this lovely family, and he drank amazing coffee and felt so sophisticated to me. It was like, Nick, you're a proper legend. And I did some bits and pieces for him, and I think it wasn't until him, he was the first person that I'd ever met that wrote music for anything, and I thought he was incredibly cool, and still do. And that was what opened it. I think probably the story for me has been about people rather than necessarily, the sort of the work itself first.
And when you say he was drinking sophisticated coffee, I'm imagining you mean Nescafe Gold blend.
not 2 scoops.
Yeah, not Nescafe regular, double scoop of Gold blend. Because certainly in Leeds in the sort of like 80s and 90s, that was that not.
Can you imagine? I mean, it was sort of, I'd literally never seen one of those. He had one of those, the cool little sort of, espresso stovetops. And this was like somebody had, I don't know. Yeah.
But it's terrible, isn't it? Because very rarely it happens these days, but I'll go somewhere, like my uncle and auntie do this. I go round to their house and they offer me a coffee, and I always say no, because they still serve instant. And my uncle does this terrible thing where he's got a little espresso machine, but it only does single shots, and if he's making 2 coffees, it's not strong enough to do. You can't do 2 coffees on a single shot. So he'll do a single shot, share it out between 2 cups, and they'll top it up with instant.
Just to give it that extra little.
Yeah, so I've just I actually ask now, is like, are we doing proper coffee? And if the answer is no, then I'm not interested. And then sometimes you go to a meeting and you'll have a sip of coffee and you'll go, wait a minute, that's instant.
To have a flashback.
Yeah, but once upon a time that was all I drank. But yeah, I'm conscious of time, Michael, so we'll kind of start to wind up. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat. It's been brilliant. I've loved it, mate. A couple of quick fire questions to finish on. I would like to do the kind of gear / plug-in porn bit, because I know people do like it. So just sort of quick fire. What's go to VST library?
Yeah, I sort of I resist this, Jim. I know this is part of a very successful format that we have, and I am sat. I mean, the computer that I'm zooming on now has got Logic open, and yes, there's a bunch of stuff in there, but I have to say I slightly dread them all, and I still use all the plugins that I've used for ages. So I use Cinematic Studio Strings to do my mock-ups and things, but I sort of I think if there was an audio way of describing the slightly pained look on my face at the moment, then is there a sound effect for that? We could drop that in. There
is. I can certainly find one. Yeah, it'd be sort of like an animal dying slowly.
Yeah, exactly. A sort of resignation and kind of like, I know we need to. It's just like,
Okay, so we'll just say cinematic strings. I mean, it's just, I think it's always one of those things. Is sort of, I think people always think that you sort of probably got like 3 different rigs and you're running Vienna Symphonic, but it's like, it doesn't matter. And at the end of the day, if you're re-recording the strings anyway, you're literally doing a mock-up. And obviously that ties in with what you were saying earlier, which is don't finish a cue, just sort of do a mock-up, a rough mock-up.
And do you know what, Jim? I have been that soldier. I was on the Giga Studio thing with PC Slaves like way back, and spending what then was definitely the price of a family car on a bunch of computers, and as we climbed up that hill, it got more and more extraordinary what you can do, and I think I just got more and more disillusioned with doing it, and gosh, there are people out there that can make the computers sing, and it sounds extraordinary, but it's a means to an end. I've got a very old dusty bin Mac Pro here that I'm sort of refusing to update, and I've turned into that bloke, angry man shouting at what that Simpsons meme. I am
yeah. It's still running Snow Leopard or whatever, because you're worried about updating it in case something stops working, and then it takes you a week to find out what's not working.
Exactly.
So yeah. Okay, well, we'll ask about sort of go-to piece of gear, because you said you've got a couple of pieces of gear there in your home studio. So there must have been, you've gone into this big studio in London. You've gone, right, you're coming with me. You're coming with me. What are we talking?
Do you know what? It's literally, as again, very timely. As we speak, there are things being unplugged and put in cars down in London right now to bring them here. Because I genuinely, again, whether it's sort of confirmation bias because I've paid for these things and they're expensive, then there's some bits of kit that I think get me where I want to go to faster. And so I've got a couple of Bricasti reverbs and the outboard ones, and I know there are plugins, and I just can get there faster with the outboard. I just turn it on and it sounds fine, and so I can move on. And then I've got a little collection of outboard that I like. So I've got a little valve mixer called a Fat Bustard, and I use that on the string stem, because if I am doing hybrid real recorded strings and samples, then I haven't been able to make anything do what the Fat Bustard does, which is sort of distort in a very jolly way the strings. It sort of brings everything to life. And again, it's just got like 2 or 3 knobs on it that I twiddle, so it's just there and it's done. And the same if I'm doing telly, a lot of it is in stereo, sort of stems, but ultimately you're delivering in stereo. And so I've got a kind of mastering chain of a Prism EQ, and then a Rupert Neve Designs master bus processor, and then their master bus converters to get back into the computer. And you might say it's overkill. And I promised Nick, who works with me and has done for years and years, when we set up in my cozy garage study, I said, Nick, I'll do it all on plugins. It's fine. We don't need to bring anything from the studio. And I tried it, Jim. I did try. I sat there for an afternoon, and I go, I'm not sure. No. Can we just?
it's one of these debates, isn't it, which rages on YouTube and on internet forums about. But I am a staunch advocate. I think that when you put audio through circuitry, something happens, whether it's solid state or whatever. And talking about the Fat Bustard, it affects the sound and it creates the harmonics and it creates imperfections. It's all about the imperfections, and the human ear likes those imperfections. And so I'm totally sold in it. I mean, I'm very much in a digital domain at the moment, because I've moved out of London, so I'm sort of in a halfway house. But I just stand by that. It's like, you could DI a guitar straight into the computer, but it's not the same as when you put it through an amp, because there's a lot of other variables, not least the circuitry in the amp, but then the microphone, the heat of the room, the distance for it. There's lots of things happening, which is so difficult to recreate. So no, I'm with you. I think that gear, and it just adds a gloss, a sheen, a little bit of magic that it's almost intangible. You can't even explain it, and it's even when you A/B them, you're like, well, there's a difference, but it's hard to know what it is. But it's there. But
I remember you sent me a while back, I think when you were about to indulge in buying a bit of, I think that was a AMS Neve.
It was at 8816, the analog summer.
Yeah. And you said, and genuinely, because it's rarely possible to have a genuine sort of blind A/B unless you're setting up an ABX thing with somebody helping you. But I listened to, I think you've done two bounces or 2 mixes, and I listened to them without knowing which was which. Probably because I wasn't concentrating. I hadn't read the email properly. What am I doing?
I deliberately didn't say. Right. Yeah, that was it. And
one was clearly better. Was very clearly better to my ears, anyway.
Yeah, it was, and it was. I say unanimously. I think I've sent to about 8 people, and I only think one of them came back saying that they but for me, that's as a jury, that stands up in court for me. So yeah,
and I think this sort of what rounds it off with the tech, I think for me, is that when it's good, it disappears for me. And so that's why we're just getting those bits of outboard, just to sit down next to me on the chair when there's got some little racks just coming, because when like when you're playing, the instrument disappears, on a good day anyway. You're not thinking about the mechanism of the piano. You're just, without sounding like Yorkshire Yoda, you are sort of one with the instruments. And that's when the tech and the gear really works for me. And because I know there's bits of outboard, and I know what is going to happen when I turn the distortion up on the Fat Bastard 1, and I know what's going to happen if I sort of like shove some of that Bicasti with in my case a luxuriantly long 3.5 second reverb tail on. So there can never be enough reverb for me. So and then I just enter, again on a good day, I just enter some slightly weird zone where I'm kind of in there's lots of great research on flow states and stuff that I'm fascinated by. So anything that takes me out of that flow state has to go, so that I can just spend as much time in it as possible. And I think this is I'll probably finish on this rather grandiose statement, but I think individuals spending time in whatever their flow state is for them. Obviously, we're talking about music, which is both of our deep passions, but can be absolutely anything. But I just think is good for the world. It's just a really, really good thing. It's sort of adds to the sort of beauty of everything that we're making, and sort of gets everybody slightly free from the kind of commercial pressures that are on everybody. It's sort of. And that can be anything. Crafts, I think, are beautiful. People who do crafts and woodwork, and bring it on.
Well, that seems like a profound moment on which to leave proceedings, Michael. So just quickly, if people, obviously we've got The Hope of Better Weather is out now. That's available on all major streaming platforms. When can we expect Whitsun?
Coming up this year, definitely a 2022 release. And for anybody that does enjoy physical, like vinyl and physical forms of music, if you go to michaelpricemusic.com, there is a shop where there's things like, I think there's Dracula vinyl left, there's some Sherlock vinyl coming as well. So, and there's Hope of Better Weather, there's a lovely LP version of that for those who enjoy that kind of thing.
To have that lovely tangible version, the product, which is sort of gone from kind of modern streaming world.
That's it.
But well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Jim, very welcome, sir.
Well, good luck with finishing off Whitsun, and obviously season 5 of Unforgotten, and whichever other incredible projects. Fingers crossed for the BAFTA nomination as well.
Yes, that just came in this morning. So well done, team Unforgotten.
Yeah,
I hope it might be another free dinner. You never know.
Yeah, obviously anyone listening to this in the future will know the result of that already. But we will cross our fingers and wait. But
thank you.
All the best, mate, and chat to you soon.
Thanks, Jim. A pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larkmusic.com. Larkmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larkmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.